The budget is out, the reviews are in, and mostly I would say that Justin Trudeau's 8th budget as Prime Minister, it's not getting rave reviews. Hello, my name's Brian Lilly. This is the Full Comment Podcast, and today I want to talk to someone who knows the ins and outs of putting a budget together. Robert Asselin is the Senior Vice President of Policy at the Business Council of Canada, but from 2015 until 2017, he also worked in the office of Finance Minister Bill Morneau, helping the Trudeau government bring out their first couple of budgets. Prior to that, he'd worked as an advisor to the Prime Minister during his election campaign. He knows the world of business, he knows the world of politics, and he knows an awful lot about economics. Robert, thanks for the time today.
Thanks for having me.
The budget, I described it as tax and spend, and sometimes that's a phrase that people will throw pejoratively at Liberals. Oh, they're just tax and spend Liberals. But this really was a tax and spend budget. Program spending is up $30 billion from last year, or 7% of spending. The public debt charges now are equal to the amount we collect in GST. And there's a whole pile of new tax measures in here, not just the capital gains tax, although that is the big one. Give us your elevator pitch summary of the budget. What are your initial thoughts?
So, Brian, I would agree with your characterization of tax and spend budget. I think it's objectively true when you look at the numbers. You're looking at around $57 billion of new spending over 5 years. They're raising revenue by about $20 billion, a bit more than that over 5, mostly, as you say, with the capital gains inclusion rate provision going from 50% to 66%. They have a better economic outlook than they had in the fall statements that explain a bit of a bump. And then they're pushing a lot of past committed spending to future years, so that allows them to show better balance number, if you better deficit number, if you want. So overall, I would say at a moment where the economy is very fragile, stagnating, putting a tax on investment the way they did, I wouldn't characterize it as a good move. And on the spending side, as I said, I think it's significant spending.
The part that bothers me is that, I've covered more federal budgets than I can remember at this point, including the year that we had two, shortly after 9/11. And I understand that when we see these projections that governments make, especially 5 years out, you take them with a grain of salt. They're not going to meet, in 5 years from now, we project we will generate this much revenue or we will spend this much. That's not going to happen. The numbers will be incredibly different. But this government, over the last several years, especially under Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, the projections are like throwing darts at a board. From the budget to the fall economic statement, and from the fall economic statement to the next budget, there's always dramatic increases in spending. 1 year it was $20 billion between the budget and the fall economic statement. This time it's $30 billion from the last budget to this one. Do you feel like the government has control on spending anymore, or is this spending just going out the door for political reasons? What's driving this? We kept hearing about guardrails and precautions on spending. I don't see that anymore.
No, I think this is a government that admittedly likes to spend, believe in big government, believes that the government can solve a lot of problems that are not even in his own jurisdiction, that are mostly in provincial jurisdiction. And politically, I think this is a government also that sees itself capturing the left generally in the electorate, and so doubling down on social programs, on spending, at a time where interest rates are rising really fast, at a time where the economy is shaky. I would say a tax and spend budget is not how I would have done it personally.
The Prime Minister has described anybody that calls for spending to be reined in as calling for austerity, meaning cuts. as someone that's worked with Liberal governments in putting together budgets, you know, do you necessarily have to cut to control spending? If spending's going up by $30 billion a year, I'm sure there's ways to control that without just cutting frontline services. But, you know, the Prime Minister would make it sound like you're going to put granny on an ice floe if you suggest that spending should be controlled.
The problem that we have is the imbalance between revenues and expenditures. So I think a government can justify more expenses generally if it's willing to say to the electorate, to Canadians, that they will pay more taxes. But obviously, politicians never do that. They don't want the middle class, they don't want ordinary Canadians to pay more taxes. And so at the end, what we're doing right now is growing a deficit that is by definition now structural. And so we're putting more debt into future generations. And the problem with the debt in itself and deficit is very different when you have higher interest rates, the environment that we're in actually right now, than when you have low interest rates, which was the case mostly for about 10 years after the great financial crisis. But post-pandemic, we're in this new environment where interest rates are higher than our growth rate, essentially as a function of how the economy is growing. And so what that does is, without even further spending, your primary deficit, your deficit minus your interest rates, is growing rapidly by itself, just as a function of interest rates being higher than your growth rate. And so that's the problem we're facing. And a government that basically puts more on the credit card again for future generations. So I don't question necessarily where they decide to spend. I'm mostly critical on basically not bringing revenues in line with expenditures at this point.
One of the things that jumped out at me was when I looked at the public debt charges. I know a lot of people focus on the deficit, and I think that's important, but the deficit piles up. That becomes the debt. We have to service that debt. And the public debt charge is like the monthly minimum on your credit card bill. You're just paying the bare minimum. And that number has grown over the past several years. And I was expecting it to surpass health this year, which it did, by some $2 billion. But I was shocked when I saw, going through the numbers, that the GST, the entirety of the GST that we collect on everything across the country, is equal to the public debt charge now. So every 5% that, you or I would charge to someone for a service, or that we pay for a good that the government collects, is just going for that public debt charge. And I think that is, I know we can't get rid of the debt tomorrow, but to me, that's an example of why being fiscally prudent and not running up huge deficits is so important. That is now squeezing out other spending. I did the math, and the National Child Care Program costs $6.6 billion. We could fund that 8 times over with what we're paying for this public debt charge now on an annual basis. And as you said, because of interest rates, that's just going up.
Yeah, I think this is fundamental, Brian, for people to understand, is the amount of revenues you allocate to debt charges or the interest payments on your debt. And so now we're over 10% of, let's say 10 cents over every dollar we send to just pay the interest payments on our debt. As this number grows, I think it's easy to understand for people that we have less for everything else, as you just said. And so as this 10 cent on the dollar goes even further, 11, 12, 13, 14, you just constrain yourself on all the good stuff you want to do as a government. Independently of whether you're a conservative government or a liberal government, you're going to be much more constrained to spend either on defense, on social programs, on healthcare transfers, on childcare. And this is what people need to understand, is that, the government uses this debt to GDP ratio. We're the best of the G7. There's no problem. don't worry about this stuff. And these metrics, in my opinion, are really key. It's really the debt servicing charge that people have to look at. And as they grow, it considerably restrain a government to do everything it needs to do going forward.
Isn't going over 10% one of the warning signs?
Yes. Actually, I had the great privilege of working on a paper with David Dodge, the former Bank of Canada governor and deputy minister at finance when in the 90s when we hit the fiscal wall. And David was obviously in the first row of this fiscal crisis that him and Mr. Martin, Mr. Chrétien dealt very well. And as a result of it, we have a much better situation now. But in that paper, we basically said that once you go over 10% debt servicing cost, when your revenues exceed 10%, you're gonna get into another zone. You know, it's not like fatal from one day to another. It doesn't mean you're gonna get downgraded necessarily, but it's kind of a slippery slope where you embark on something that is more risky going forward.
I covered the Ontario budget recently, and as I've said loud and clear to Finance Minister Peter Bethlen-Falvey, they're spending too much as well, in my view. You get a sense of where I'm coming from fiscally. I like the Chrétien and Martin budgets. I like them a lot better than what we're doing now, or the Harper budgets. Those were, more constrained. They were in line with what we could afford, with what we were spending.
Right.
The debt bothers me. But one thing I will say is that through refinancing of Ontario's debt during COVID, when bonds were so low, and they took 30-year bonds at 1.4%, they've been able to shrink that percentage of what is going towards public debt charges, and it's now below 7% again. So instead of climbing, it's going down, even though they are spending more. And we just don't seem to have that in Ottawa. Robert, I looked back over, I went back to the last budget of the Harper government and compared it to yesterday's budget just to see, okay, how much have we increased spending by? And when you look at the total spend, program spending and public debt charges, we've increased spending by $247 billion. So it was $288 billion in the last Harper budget. It's $534 billion now. That's an 85% increase in spending. And when you look at the Bank of Canada inflation calculator, that's just 26.5% inflation over that time. So I know there's population growth, but there's no way that population growth is another almost 60%. Doesn't that show that this is a government with a spending problem?
It does, absolutely. I think you just summarized it very well. Part of it is due to inflation, but it's not entirely the cause of it. Obviously, there's a lot of expansion of introduction of a lot of new programs, a public service that has grown a lot, I think by 40% since 2015. Now you can say, a bigger government requires more people to be employed and render services, but again, you can, and the government has increased the revenue side as percentage of GDP. We've seen it again yesterday with the capital gain inclusion rate. So that's a choice I think the government has to justify in front of Canadians, and at the end, I think Canadians have to be conscious that a bigger government requires, more revenues, meaning higher taxes. And to me, this is where we're going for sure. Yesterday was almost maybe just the beginning. If you want to run a government to the size that they're running right now, with all the programs they are introducing at every budget every year, they're going to need much more revenue. And it can't just be a function of economic growth. They're going to have to raise taxes significantly going forward. And that's the choice that Canadians will have to make. Personally, I think it has grown too fast in the last, maybe post-pandemic, the last 3, 4, or 5 budgets. But again, that's for people to decide what kind of government, how big the government should be, especially at the federal level. And I think your point is really important, is that we live in a federation. We pay taxes to two levels of government, and you need to think about it as an aggregate. So if the Ontario government gets more indebted and the Canadian government, the federal government gets more indebted, there's only one taxpayer at the end that will pick up the bill.
Well, you mentioned that these programs are going in, but the Prime Minister keeps mentioning that. But when I look at it, something like childcare is the most developed of the additions that they brought in over the last little while. I think it's up to about $6 billion and growing. That's only 1.3% of the budget. The dental care program would barely be a rounding error. The pharmacare program, there's no budget attached to it yet to speak of. But the actual cost of running government has increased by almost 100%, 94%. Yes. Running government costs more. And you mentioned a 40% increase in the size of the civil service. And I think, as my colleague John Iveson at National Post has documented, it's well over a 30% increase in the use of consultants like McKinsey or whoever. This is, you're saying that we need to, we'll have to raise taxes. I agree that might be one issue, but I'm also thinking program review, something like what David Dodge did or Don Drummond did.
Yes,
both of them have been very critical of the current government. They seem to. I remember covering John Manley when he was the finance minister, and no one sold the idea of cutting some things in government better than Manley. He would always say, "We're moving money from low priorities to high priorities," and unfortunately, it seems that once a dollar is being spent now, it remains a government priority, whether it's still serving a purpose or not. So they're not doing a program review. They're not saying, does it still make sense to be offering this? They just add on and then don't look at how else they're spending our money.
And this is a big problem. I agree with you. Raising taxes is not a good option, especially when you have a productivity problem, you have a business investment problem, you have essentially a confidence problem for people to invest in the economy, and all the regulatory burden that we have in Canada to get big projects done, approved, permitted. It's a big problem. So I absolutely agree with you that first and foremost, when things are tight, and I think families know this, they tighten their belt. They look at their expenses and they're like, why should I cut? Maybe this year we shouldn't do a summer vacation and a winter vacation. We should cut. Maybe we should look at a way to be more efficient in our day-to-day spending. And so, unfortunately, this government always adds up. They never look back. There are stuff that is in the fiscal framework, frankly, that hasn't been looked at for decades. Agencies, commissions, tribute, all kinds of structures that we have inside departments, outside departments, that have been there for a long that at the end, it's not cutting for cutting, but you have to just ask yourself, is it doing what this is this structure or this program or this mission doing what it's supposed to do? Can we revise? Can we do it more efficiently? And these questions are essential. In my opinion, Brian, this should be an ongoing program review for any government, any time, all the time, because it's kind of important that when you spend public money, you do it the most efficiently and the most effectively possible.
Well, you said families do that with their budget. With all these online subscriptions that we all have now, and you can sign up for a service on your phone or on your laptop, and you just say, oh yeah, I'll do that. And you get a good introductory rate, and then they hit you with a $300 bill if you don't cancel the auto renew. I make it a habit now of going through my bank statement and saying, okay, I'm paying for this on a monthly basis. Do I still need that? And I think that's good for anybody to do, but I also think it's good for government to do. As I said, just because you did something once upon a time doesn't mean it still makes sense. One of my early stories when I joined the Sun in 2010 was to look at the cars and drivers and who had them. Because I remember talking to someone on Bay Street, and they said, nobody on Bay Street has a car, their own dedicated chauffeur and car anymore. You're expected to drive yourself, or if you need a car for a special occasion, you hire a service. Now people would just hire Uber. And I went through the list, and it would shock people how many civil servants you've never heard of, departments and agencies you didn't know exist. The guy at the top or the woman at the top has a dedicated car and driver. How and why do you justify that in 2024 when, allies like Britain, I think it's 3 cabinet ministers have a car and driver?
Yes, no, exactly. I think structurally, there's a lot of stuff that we've been doing again for many years that needs to be reexamined. And priorities change. We live in a very dangerous world now. Maybe in the 90s, defense wasn't seen as a priority for our country. Now, obviously, with everything that's going on, I think Canadians are rethinking that. And defense is hugely expensive. And so you cannot have it both ways. You cannot just continue to spend everywhere and continue with the same and leave kind of the ongoing spending unchecked. You need to reallocate. You need to put resource where your priorities are. And I'm just not seeing this at the federal level.
Robert, we have to take a break now, but when we come back, I do want to ask you about the tax side of this. We've talked a lot about the spending. Let's talk about the tax side and what it's going to do to productivity. 2 of the founders of Shopify, a Canadian tech juggernaut, came out very critical of what this is going to do in the tech space. Talk about that when we come back. The federal budget has a major tax increase to it. Well, not for everyone, but for some. If you listen to the government, the changes to the capital gains tax inclusion rate will only hit the 0.13% top of the income ladder. They're trying to make this out to be the guy in the Monopoly game with the monocle and top hat, and nobody else is going to be hurt by it. Entrepreneurs, they have something different to say. The CEO and the president of Shopify both slamming this change to the capital gains tax rules, small businesses, big businesses, all saying this is the wrong way to go. Robert, you said that this is a tax that's not going to help with productivity. That's an issue that we've got, or an area where we've got huge issues right now. Why do you see this as the wrong prescription for increasing tax revenues? Because you said earlier, you're not against increasing tax revenues and bringing them in line with where you want to spend, but you said this isn't the right way.
Well, just on the last point you just made, the easiest thing that government could have done is just do less spending, and so you don't have to enter into this discussion on higher taxes. That would have been the most efficient way to do this. But on the capital gains inclusion rate change from yesterday, at a moment where our main problem structurally is a lack of business investments that is driving down productivity, you don't want to, bringing in a tax on investment, which is essentially what they did yesterday, just on the psychology of people wanting to take risk, wanting to invest for their own benefit, essentially. Of course, it is something that I think is very detrimental. You almost kind of see it, you can conceive of it as a tax on success. People who try to make money, they take chances, they invest, they start companies, and even for people who have through their lives accumulate a little bit of wealth, a cottage or something that they consider as an important investment for their retirement, they're going to be touched by this. And so I just think timing-wise, it couldn't have been a worse moment. Again, at a moment where our business investment climate is not ideal, where there's a lack of confidence for people to form capital in our economy, making capital even more expensive, I think, is not a good idea.
I heard from one business owner who is in the manufacturing sector. He has a couple of plants in the GTA. He has plants in the United States and elsewhere. In total, about 600 odd employees. 250, I believe, are in the Toronto area. He said, at this point, if he's going to expand, this makes it less likely for him to expand inside Canada. And it's a story I've heard from several small and medium-sized manufacturers. These are people who, yeah, admittedly, they're well off, but the money's tied up in their company, which is employing hundreds of people with good-paying jobs. And now they just say, well, I'd be better off putting that in North Carolina or Michigan or Texas or wherever, because, you know, if they grow that business and it's a success and they sell it, they're going to get dinged with a lot more taxes. They're already paying income taxes on any profits, and then they have to pay a capital gains tax on top of that. I don't think people realize that part, that you're still facing double taxation on this.
Yeah, it's essentially what capital gains is when you think of it. I think it's very damaging, to be honest, also to engage in this kind of class war, populism angle for politicians. You know, capital is required in the economy. Some people have more of it. People at the end form business, they employ people, they pay wages, it puts food on people's table and families' table. I don't think we should be, as Canadians, envious of people who are successful. There are a lot of people who started with nothing, build up great big corporations that employ hundreds of Canadians, thousands of Canadians, and that's really important. And also as shareholders, and people who invest in Canadian companies' stocks, you want your company to succeed. You know, you want a good return on your investment, and so kind of trying to bring down people who are successful in business, I think, is a very bad thing to do. I think it's not helpful, because at the end, if we reduce the size of our pie, where all of us, we're going to have each less for each of us. And as we're saying with GDP per capita, it is declining. It has been declining for the last 6 quarters. I don't think that's a good trajectory, a good objective for Canada. At the end, yes, we want to redistribute some wealth. We want to make sure everyone can succeed. But first, we have to create wealth. To create wealth, you need capital. If you put always taxes on success and on capital, then I think we're going to have less of it, you know.
Harvey Finkelstein from Shopify asked on X, what are we doing, Canada, in response to this change? Toby Lucky, who was the CEO, said, message from a friend, Canada has heard rumors about innovation and is determined to leave no stone unturned in deterring it. He sees this as killing off innovation, in killing off a move to a more productive economy. You mentioned that capital's expensive and it's needed. You know, the Prime Minister and his whole government have gone around talking about the need to make sure that there's capital available for building apartments. They want to encourage people to build more apartments, build more homes because of the housing crisis. All of this makes it less likely for the private sector to get involved in doing that. You make a profit, you're going to be punished more for making a profit, even if it's on affordable homes.
I think it's an important point. For everything the government is trying to do, energy transition, housing, building a greater supply of houses, you need a private sector that is willing to invest, that is willing to help you solve this problem, this challenge for our country. And if you basically take the attitude that I'm the government, I can do it on my own, I don't need the private sector, well, it's just going to be, you're not going to be successful. And our economy will suffer as a result of it. So it's the attitude vis-a-vis business that it's really important. I think also this, like, business bashing movement that we're seeing right now, that being successful is bad, being a big business is bad. Well, it turns out that it's these very businesses that, as I said, provide good wages to employees, that provide the shareholders good returns on their investments. Um, and at the end of the day, we want better living standards. And for that, we need a dynamic economy. I really want to point out this aspect. Economic dynamism is really important. Why is the US outperforming? Because they are taking risks, they are taking chances. They have innovators who fail once, twice, sometimes before building amazing companies. If you don't develop this culture here in Canada, or if you downplay it, I should say, you can't have an economy that resides just in consumption, real estate, and government spending. You need an economy that resides on economic dynamism, entrepreneurial spirit, innovators. And I feel with this tax move, we're just sending a really bad signal.
Well, the balanced budget period that the Chrétien Liberals brought in, followed by tax cuts, not only did it help spur some of what you're talking about there, but government revenues went up despite tax cuts.
Yes, yes,
And people seem to forget that that is another option. If you grow the economy, then government revenue will go up. They decided to take less from every company, but they got more from companies as a whole. And also, it makes it less attractive to hire a whole floor of lawyers and accountants to find loopholes.
yes, exactly.
So it's incredible to watch. In terms of what they could have done, what could they be doing to spur productivity? The Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada gave a very stark warning about where we're at in terms of productivity just a few weeks ago. And I'm not sure that that in the middle of the CEO bashing you were talking about, that anyone was listening. Actually, just before, I want to point out that the CEO bashing going on is a cross-partisan activity right now. I don't know if you saw Mirko Bibic appear, the CEO of Bell Canada Enterprises. He was berated by MPs from every single party. And it wasn't even on the topic that they were supposedly there to discuss. They just wanted to beat him up, same as they did to Galen Weston a little while ago. CEOs get about as much respect in Ottawa from all parties as a convicted murderer these days. Being a CEO, creating jobs, creating, for a company like Bell, pretty much if you have a pension or an RRSP, you're holding Bell stock, and their dividends are helping pay for your retirement. That is considered bad now. And it's across party lines, which I think is very dangerous. It's not just the NDP or a flank of the Liberal Party now. It's the Conservatives and all Liberals as well.
Yeah, that's a very unfortunate development. Again, everybody wants to be a workers' party, and I totally understand how important it is for the middle class to succeed. But the reality is, if we don't have successful companies, if we don't have scaled companies, companies to a certain size, you're just not going to see the wages and the living standards that we've enjoyed over the last 50 years in Canada. You actually need these big companies to succeed, so that employees are equally successful. So it's not a race to the bottom; it's a race to success, and taking more chances, competing against companies globally, not just in Canada. So for that to happen, you need successful multinationals that are established in Canada.
What are the steps the government could have taken? I know that you've been looking at this along with people like Sean Spear from the Hub. You've written paper with David Dodge. You've been taking a deep dive at this. What are some of the policies that they could have looked at?
So first and foremost, it's about creating a macroeconomic environment that is conducive of people wanting to invest. So just as a very concrete example, if it takes 15 years for a mining company or oil and gas company to get a permit to exploit a new pipeline or a new mine, obviously people will make different decisions, and investors might turn to other countries that have a more nimble, agile regulatory process. And again, I'm not saying that there should not be any environmental assessment process or stuff like that, but is it reasonable that in a country like Canada, it would take 15 years or more than 10 years to get a big project approved? That's something we could fix without money. That would give us a lot in terms of confidence of people to invest in our country. And then, other than obviously the macroeconomic environment, and by the way, the fiscal situation is really important, because if you keep running structural deficit down the road, with investors and people who make business decisions, including CEOs, will conclude is that taxes will eventually need to go up. And that's not a good thing when you're trying to make money, to see an environment where you're going to have higher taxes down the road. And so that's a big break to people thinking about future investments. And on a productivity side, what drives it really at the end, Brian, and you see it in countries like the United States, is innovation. Innovation is something we're not good at. We've been very complacent, I guess, depending on our U.S. trading partner, depending on our natural resources, which are a great gift for Canada. We have not pushed enough on innovation. And as a result, our productivity numbers have been very, very weak. And so we have to do better at innovation. We have to invest more in R&D, public R&D, private R&D, scale our business. We're very much a SME economy. And again, I love small businesses. There's nothing wrong with that. But to invest and be more productive, you need to scale. You need to sell to produce and sell goods to the world. And we need more global champions in competitive industries.
But you need the Shopifys that start as a small company to become a big company that now employs 8,000 people.
Exactly. That's a great example.
Yeah, it's, all of the companies that we have that are big once started out small. And, they only get big because of success. And if you're going to tax them to success, that won't work. One of my favorite lines about taxation is Winston Churchill saying that taxing your way to prosperity is like a man standing in a bucket and trying to pull himself up by the handle. I want to thank you for your time today, Robert. It's been an interesting conversation, and it's unfortunately one that we'll likely have again. There's at least one more budget from the government, and they seem more determined to, as you say, play a populist thing. Since Donald Trump came along, we've acted as if populism is only on one side. Populism can come from all fronts, and this is very much a populist budget with a lot of class warfare and I would say age group warfare or demographic warfare baked into the middle of it. But I don't see it helping deal with the economic woes that are affecting our country.
Agreed.
Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you for your time.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prude with theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. You can subscribe to Full Comment on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, listen through the app or Alexa-enabled devices, and help us out. Leave a review, give us a rating, tell your friends about us, email your Aunt May in Whitby, let her know that she should be listening. Thank you for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.